I'm very pleased to be here, and I would like to give my thanks to Gallery Hyundai for inviting me, and especially to Pat for making this opportunity available. So typically people understand Korean contemporary art along two axes. So one is the formalist modernism that is represented by 단색화, the monochrome painting, and the other is centered around 1980s Minjung art, which was a more socially engaged art. And this kind of divides the 1970s and 80s along ideological lens. But what I'm trying to do is that there was this stream of experimental art in Korea at the time that cannot be easily put into either or of these camps. And Park Hyunki belongs to this group of experimental artists who are based in Daegu in the 1970s. And Daegu, this southeastern city away from the capital of Seoul, was a very ideal place for experimenting with different media for these artists at the time, because 1970s, that was during the regime of President Park Chung-hee, and being in the capital city of Seoul, there was a lot of surveillance by the police, so artists weren't really free to experiment with what they wanted to, while that's being in Daegu, away from these eyes of the government, so to speak. They could go out to the outdoors of Nakdong River and experiment in a more freestyle kind of way. So I think Park Hyunki, when he went back to Daegu, away from Seoul, he was able to encounter his fellow artists in this region, and he established the Daegu Contemporary Artists Association, and they started doing the Daegu Contemporary Art Festival every year. And I feel that his practice in video as well as in performance, installation came out from this outdoor environment, and also this very welcoming environment for experimentation in Daegu at the time. I mean, in and of themselves, there's nothing wrong with these words, but they often they can often be used in a way that can lead to misunderstanding of Asian artists. And first of all, I think the word Eastern is a bit too broad, so I think there's a need to make it more concrete. So I would say that Park Hyunki was interested in rediscovering and excavating pre-modern forms of knowledge in Korean aesthetics. And to give a concrete example of that would be the TV stone tower. So in Korean, we use this word 돌탑 to refer to stone towers. And this wasn't some kind of metaphysical thing for him, but it was based on his very concrete experience of having been a war refugee. When the Korean War broke out, his family and Park at the time was an elementary school. They were moving southwards away from the communists in the north. And as they were moving downward, they came across these various stone towers that were strewn on the streets, built by anonymous people. And this structure, the form was very vivid, and that really struck the young Park at the time. So it's not separated from reality to him. It's very concrete, it's very material. So in the stone tower, the way it's built up by various people who are nameless, basically, but these are sort of visual manifestations of the hopes that these people carried amidst this very difficult situation of running away from the war. So I think for him, you could say that it was both. It was very concrete material encounter with these forgotten visual forms that were present in Korean shamanism, but also it wasn't separated from his reality. He encountered that in his own life, and he thought about the ways to reincarnate it, so to speak, in the present. So the past forms and the present reality is not separate from each other, but they're sort of enmeshed and are constantly in conversation with each other. The first untitled work in 1978 that he made was he used a real stone, found stones from the Nakdong River, and then he inserted simulated stones that were made out of resin, and they had different colors. So one had this kind of amber-like color, and the other had more like a ruby-like color. And you could see that the real stone, it's not transparent, it's opaque. So the light doesn't filter through that. While as the simulated stones made with resin, when light filters through those works, you can see that they're made of transparent surface. So although the form is similar, so they're both made in the form of stone, the texture is very different. And the way the light could filter or not filter through them also gives you a very different experience of each stone versus simulated stone. So I think the artist designed this work for people to come into contact with different materialities of the stone and discern with their eyes, okay, which one is real and which one is illusory, right? So this contrast between what is real versus what is virtual starts with this work, begins with this work, and then it becomes developed into TV Stone Tower in 1979. And in that work, he replaces the simulated stone made of resin with a video recorded image of the real stone. So now instead of stacking a real stone with a simulated stone made out of resin, he's stacking a real stone with the video image of that stone. So visually, when you look at the work from a distance, your mind starts to build this shape of a stone tower, and you immediately replace the image of the stone on the monitor as one unit of the entire stone tower. So then you kind of think about, okay, this stone that I'm seeing in front of my eyes, which is real, but then what is inserted on top of that or in between that is an illusory image of this stone. So you start to think about, okay, what is the relation between the real image versus the illusion of this image? And then you become aware of how the video technology acts as a mediator of your viewing experience. So I think that transition from a simulated stone made out of resin into a video recorded image of the actual stone is very interesting to me because it shows how his thinking is evolving at different times. Sure, yeah. So the 1978 work is the first video work by Park Hyunki. And the way it started was that he had rented the studio of 𝘗 who was a photographer at the time. It was called one of his studios. So he rented this studio called, Studio K after 𝘗. And he had this water basin in which he was planning to develop his photo negatives. And he had set up his video camera and was just wondering, okay, what should I shoot for my first video work? And at the time, the building in which he was in, which was made out of a wooden structure, began to shake a little because of the wind. And as he was staring at this basin of water he had just put in front of him, he started to notice that the light stand he had set up was reflected on the water and it began to shake. So he was like, oh, wait a minute, this light stand, which is a very still object, it's starting to turn into a moving image. So he was really enraptured by this image and he kept looking at it. And then once the trembling subsided, it returned back to a still image. So he experimented with putting his finger into the water and stirring it. So the still water becomes moving again. And then once he took out his finger, it subsided and returned into a still image again. So I think for him, this discovery was very exciting that you could turn a still image into a moving image through a reflection of it on the water. And by filming it with video, you can actually turn this three-dimensional object, which is a light stand, into constantly moving two-dimensional image. So this kind of back and forth between still and moving image, sort of very concrete materiality versus this very fluid, you could say almost like a liquid-like quality of moving image really fascinated him. And I think his video works really began to emerge out of that experience. The Daegu Contemporary Art Festival was very important for Park and his fellow artists. It began from 1974, and each year they had a different rendition of the show. And before they started exhibiting film and video works, they actually had outdoor exhibitions near the Nakdong River. So Park and his fellow artists had this experience of going out into the nature and shooting their work in that kind of open environment. So this kind of moving beyond the white cube, so to speak, moving beyond the limited spatial configurations of museum or gallery space for them, I think was very exciting. And once you're out in the outdoors, you naturally become more perceptive to the qualities of light, how that changes over time, how the intensity of light subsides, and the colors around you start to change as the sun sets. And I think all these factors are really visible in Park's untitled 1979 work, in which he basically filmed the Nakdong River while inserting mirror to the ground of the river. So the mirror actually starts to function as a real-time monitor, so to speak, because you see how the mirror reflects the changing colors of the waves of the river as time progresses. And you can also hear some sounds of the birds chirping and some children playing in the playground. And when he exhibited this work, he had made it into a kind of a 5-channel video work. Of course, at the time, he didn't have the technology for that. So he had 5 monitors set up, and each monitor replayed different sections of the video that he had recorded. So the viewers could sense this temporal progression of how the scenery changes according to the passing of time. So it was akin to kind of being there on the site, although you're not on the site per se, and really feeling how time changes in nature and how that changes the scenery. And video as a temporal medium, as a time-based medium, has duration as one of its central qualities, and I think that really comes out very well in this work. When I first found out about this work, I was just astonished by the sheer scale of this project and the fact that it took place in 1981. So I really wanted to mention this, that the first time Korean government or Korean media started to have color TV broadcasting was December 1980, and at the time the government had just changed to President Chun Doo-hwan's regime, and he had started this policy of really using mass media to publicize a very positive image of his regime. So people started watching color images on television, color moving images on a daily basis. So advertisement and even the way people dress started to change as they became more aware of color in general. So there was this outpouring of vivid color streaming into daily life, and people were really kind of almost glued to this image of fascinating, vibrant images on television. And I think what Park was trying to do with this very ambitious project, I would like to say, is to kind of make people question, what is the image that I'm seeing daily on television? Is that reality? So what is the difference between what I'm seeing and how that's represented on television by media as moving images. So this idea of representation, the limitation of representation, what media can convey, and what they convey, is it all true? Can you really trust that? I think was one of the driving questions for this work. So one of the interesting things is that, so this stone is not real. It's also a simulated stone, and it could be held by 5 adults. So it was heavy, but it wasn't impossible to move them around. So when they had this simulated stone, also had a mirror attached on the surface, they installed it in front of the Bank of Daegu, and basically passers-by, pedestrians, people going to work, children, they were all immediately attracted to the scene, because not just this stone was what was interesting them. They knew and they could see that a bunch of people were filming this. So it seemed like, oh, what are they shooting? What are they filming? So there's this immediate attraction to moving images or media, and they start looking and start going around, and some children even touch the surface of the stone. And one woman asks in the video, is this a real stone? So there is this kind of confusion, like, why is this stone with a mirror attached to it? Like, why is it in the middle of the street? What is it doing? But then people are just like so enthusiastic about it and excited to see their faces on the mirror. So I think it's a very clever way of turning around what you're used to seeing, because usually on television you see advertisements of commodities, right? Things that you will want to buy. But now what you're seeing is your own reflection and the city, parts of the city. You know, you see parts of the building, you see parts of the transmission towers. So you're seeing things that you are used to seeing on a daily life, but things that you never really expected to see on a television screen or a monitor. And by turning those very mundane realities of life, or even urban skyscrapers, into something that could hold your attention, I think he gives people a very unique experience in the city. And I would also like to stress the part that this took place not in a rural environment, but smack in the middle of the city on the broad daylight. So I think this kind of interaction with people really gives them a chance to be more than a passive consumer of television and become a more active participant in this work. I think with his previous works, the video sort of becomes, like you said, a medium that connects the events that happen inside the gallery with the events that happen outside the gallery. So for example, in Pass Through the City that we just discussed, people who visited the Mekhyang Gallery, once you enter into the gallery, you could see live footage of the image in which people were interacting with the stone in front of the Bank of Daegu. And that kind of connected the people inside the gallery with what is currently happening real time in front of the Bank of Daegu outside the gallery. So in this sense, at this Soo Gallery exhibition with this work, what happens is that audio, in other words, the sound, starts to play the role of moving image, or what the moving image used to play in the previous role. So people are listening to the sound of their own footsteps within the gallery, which is a live feedback of their footsteps recorded. And once they start listening to that, they also realize the sound source changes, and they start listening to the cars honking, the urban noise, and the sound of the artist moving the stones around. But because the microphone is attached to the amplifier, it almost sounds as if the stones are kind of rolling around with this like clashing into each other. It sounds like a very big rock kind of colliding with each other. So back and forth, you start listening to the sound that is happening right now, and with your own body becoming in contact with the wooden floor, because that's the sound that you're listening. That's how your footsteps make a sound, right? So you are aware of the concrete space that you're standing on, you're walking around, and what you're seeing in front of you, but also you are listening to what I wrote as what the stone has to tell you, how the stones came into this place. So when Park used his video camera, he slung it over his shoulder and took a taxi basically from his studio to the gallery. So it records the kind of journey that he had before entering into this gallery space. So the viewers are listening the sound of the stones itinerary, so to speak. So it's both the stones kind of telling their own story, how they got here to the audience, and the audience also listening to the sound that their own body is making as it comes into contact with the space of the gallery. So it kind of goes back and forth between what lies inside versus what lies outside the gallery. So the sound is acting as a mediator or translator of that experience. So interestingly enough, he has written on his back with a black marker pen, "I'm not a stone," and in front of his chest, he writes "stone" and so forth. So people are kind of intrigued by this gesture, like what does that mean, right? And the way I think about it is that in one of his drawing books in which he writes his memos, he has written that although man desires to be nature, he cannot be nature itself, right? And I think this has a very significant meaning for this work, in which I feel that, in the early 1980s, so this is already 1983, the urban population in Korea started to grow astronomically, and many people had left the rural areas in which they were born into, and more and more people were migrating into the big cities. So Daegu was, one of those big cities in Korea as well. And with the arrival of color television and basically moving image becoming part of daily life, people's experience with nature or organic materials such as stones became more rarefied. I mean, it didn't really happen that frequently. So people's experience of nature often happened through the mediation of media, through what you see on television. Oh, there's a wildfire, there's a fire burning somewhere in some remote mountain. So it seems very distant from you and steps away from you. But I think what Park Hyunki is recreating here is that he's trying, in a way, it has some humorous aspects as well, right? So this urban man is desperately trying to sort of return back to those pastoral days in which he was one with nature, right? Initially, we didn't have the need to clothe ourselves or even live in houses. We were basically one of the wild nature. But his actions of wanting to become one with nature, for example, you see him crouching his body into this shape to simulate the shape of the stone. He tries so hard to blend himself with the stones around him. But obviously, his back says the obvious thing, I'm not a stone. And his body cannot help but stand out amidst this stone surrounding him. So I think it kind of shows in a very humorous way this urban man's desire to become one with nature, but can't really get to fulfill that desire. So I find it as a sort of humorous comment on the predicament of urban life and this idea of wanting to be part of nature but cannot. So that kind of struggle is portrayed in a rather hilarious, humorous way. I would like to give the audience general information about how these works were made first. So each of the works So one image, one screen is actually consists of 81 squares of moving images. So Park Hyunki and his technical assistant, they would find a floppy disk, a CD basically, of pornographic videos that were illegally circulated at the time, and they would take out a very small portion of that image and then burn it on a CD. And then they would find another pornographic source and then cut that also in a square-shaped image and then put it next to the first image. So it's like cutting out and burning pixel by pixel. And they were doing this all by hand at the time because they didn't have the Photoshop technology at the time. So you can imagine how much time this would take. And they said that making one square-shaped image took an entire day. So this basically took them 81 days to build one layer of image. And then Park had in his possession this book on Tantric Buddhism that he was very interested in, Tantric Buddhist iconography, basically, which a lot of it you can see in Tibetan Buddhism. And he was really interested in these images, so he scanned those images page by page, and they started layering one image on top of another. So you see this layer of Buddhist iconography passing by your eyes in a very rapid speed because it is it's about 30 frames per second. So your eyes can't really discern each image. It just goes before your eyes like a flash. So this work is very interesting because he is constantly differentiating the number of frames per second. So the way your eye perceives the movement of images is constantly changing because it's at a different frequency, at a different speed. So some of the images flash by really quickly, like a blink of an eye, and then other images comes by more slowly. And also in terms of the sound, you also hear a cacophony of different sounds together. So you hear the sound of sexual intercourse, a lot of moaning, as you are watching the images of bodhisattvas kind of flying in front of your eyes in various different postures, attaining enlightenment. So this, he is in a way engaging with the body in a very different way, or we perceive it as a different way because the way the human body is portrayed in a pornographic video, for instance, it's very visceral. You know, it's in your face. You just see a male body and a female body constantly colliding into each other, while as the image of the images of the body that you see in Tantric Buddhism, it is an idealized image, right? It's an image that's based on an imagination of an ideal union between God and humans, which is represented mostly as a male deity and the female consorts. So there is this kind of brutal, I would say, juxtaposition between just a pornographic imagery, very in-your-face image of how the human body is portrayed. And it's also a very distorted way of viewing human body and the sexual intercourse, the genre of pornography itself. And he's juxtaposing that with the most sacred form of human reunion, the bodies coming together. And in a sense, the purpose of those Buddhist iconography was to kind of transcend your body, right? Transcend the limitation of this real life to imagine a better life, right? A better state of enlightenment. So it's a really idealized form. So by clashing these two, something that is considered very low grade, like pornography, illegal pornography, versus something that was supposed to bring you closer to enlightenment, to surpass the limitations of your own body, I think that experience also shows how he's leveling and kind of crashing down these hierarchies between low and high culture. So I think it gives people an understanding of how the human body can be considered as both a very low but also a sacred form that leads to enlightenment. So it's a very double-edged sword in a way, and I think that this work portrays that very effectively.